Life can be strange sometimes. My uncle once told me that some marriages work better when there are no kids involved. I never understood what he meant until I lived through it myself. Looking back now, I realize how true those words were, especially in my case. I grew up in a house where fighting was normal. My parents fought over everything, from what to cook for dinner to which TV channel to watch, from whose turn it was to do the dishes to who spent too much money at the grocery store. If you've ever seen those teenage couples who break up and get back together every week, that was my parents, except they were stuck together because of marriage and me. Our house was always filled with tension. Even on good days when they weren't fighting, you could feel it in the air, like a storm waiting to happen. Sometimes the fights would start over the smallest things. My dad would leave his coffee mug on the table instead of putting it in the dishwasher, and my mom would start complaining. He would say something back, she would raise her voice, and before you knew it, they were bringing up things that happened years ago. I learned early that when they started fighting, I needed to hide. Sometimes I'd go to the bathroom and lock myself in. Other times, I'd hide under my bed or in my closet. The sound of things breaking and doors slamming became as normal to me as the neighbor's dog barking or cars passing by our house. They would throw anything they could get their hands on, plates, books, remote controls. Once, my dad even threw my mom's favorite vase at the wall. When I was little and cried during their fights, they'd yell at me to shut up. My mom would say I was making things worse, and my dad would tell me to go to my room. Over time, I learned not to show any emotion when they fought. I just became quiet and tried to make myself invisible. I'd sit in my room, doing homework or pretending to read, while trying not to listen to their screaming matches downstairs. School became my escape. I would leave early in the morning and come back as late as I could. The library became my favorite place. It was quiet there, peaceful. The librarian, Mrs. Peterson, would sometimes give me cookies and let me stay until closing time. She never asked questions, but I think she knew something wasn't right at home. Things started changing when my mom's parents stepped in. They lived a few hours away and would visit every month. During one visit, they witnessed one of my parents' worst fights. My dad had forgotten my mom's birthday, and she completely lost it. They were throwing things and screaming so loud that our neighbors called the police. That was when my grandparents decided enough was enough. They gathered the whole family for what they called a family meeting. My aunts, uncles, and even some close family friends came. They gave my parents two choices: either go to marriage counseling or separate. My parents sat there, not looking at each other, while everyone talked about how their behavior was affecting me. Finally, after hours of discussion, they agreed to try counseling. The first few sessions didn't seem to help much. My parents would come back angrier than before, blaming each other for having to waste money on therapy. But slowly, things started to change. The fighting became less frequent, and when they did argue, they didn't throw things anymore. They actually talked to each other instead of screaming. But as their relationship got better, something else got worse. They started ignoring me. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice at first. My mom stopped making my breakfast. First it was once or twice a week. Then it became every day. My dad stopped driving me to school, always saying he had early meetings. Instead of taking care of me, they'd just leave money on the kitchen counter for food and tell me to take the bus. They started going on dates and dinners together, leaving me at home with leftovers or frozen meals. At first, I was happy they weren't fighting anymore, but then I started feeling lonely. They would spend hours planning their weekend trips, but never included me. When I tried to tell them about my good grades or something nice that happened at school, they'd barely look at me, just nodding without really listening. I started feeling like a ghost in my own house. I would walk into a room, and they would stop talking. They would make plans right in front of me without ever asking if I wanted to join. Once, they even forgot to tell me they were going away for the weekend. I came home from school on Friday to find a note saying there was pizza money in the drawer and they'd be back Sunday night. When I turned 14, I wanted to have my first real birthday party. I had never had one before. My parents always said parties were a waste of money, but I thought maybe now that things were better between them, they might agree. I spent weeks gathering courage to ask them. I even made a budget, showing them it wouldn't cost much. I only wanted to invite 5 friends, have some pizza and cake, maybe watch a movie. I picked a moment when they seemed to be in a good mood. They had just come back from their dinner date, and my mom was laughing at something my dad said. I approached them carefully and asked if I could have a small party for my birthday. My mom's smile disappeared immediately. She said I was wasting their money, that I should be grateful for everything they already did for me. When I got upset and told them how they never did anything for me except give me food and a place to sleep, she slapped me. It was the first time she had ever hit me. That night changed everything. For the next week, they barely acknowledged my existence. They whispered to each other when I was around and stopped talking when I entered the room. I knew something was coming, but I never expected what happened next. They sat me down in the living room one evening after dinner. My dad started talking in this calm, cold voice I had never heard before. He said their marriage was perfect now, except for one thing, me. He called me their biggest failure, their greatest mistake. He said I was the reason they almost got divorced, that having me had ruined their lives. My mom just sat there nodding, adding that having me around reminded them of how much they didn't want to be parents. Then they told me I had to leave. They wanted me to move in with my grandparents, and if my grandparents didn't want me, I'd have to figure something out on my own. I was only 14, but they didn't care. They said they had already called my grandparents to come pick me up the next day. I sat there, unable to move, unable to speak. The people who were supposed to love me more than anyone else in the world had just told me they didn't want me anymore, that I was a mistake, that their lives would be better without me. That was when my phone buzzed. It was my grandmother, texting to say they were on their way to get me. My parents had already told them everything. When my grandparents arrived, I had never seen my grandmother so angry. Her face was red, and her hands were shaking as she walked into our house. My grandfather, usually quiet and calm, looked like he wanted to punch my dad. They didn't waste time with greetings or small talk. "Pack your things," my grandmother said to me. "All of them." Her voice was gentle when she spoke to me, but when she looked at my parents, her eyes were cold. I went to my room and started throwing my clothes into bags. My hands were shaking so much I could barely zip them up. My grandmother came to help me pack while my grandfather stayed downstairs with my parents. I could hear him talking in a low, angry voice, but I couldn't make out the words. As we packed, I kept thinking my parents would come upstairs. I kept hoping they would say it was all a mistake, that they didn't mean it, that they wanted me to stay. But they never came. When I went downstairs with my bags, they were sitting in the kitchen, holding hands and looking out the window. They didn't even turn around to say goodbye. The first few weeks at my grandparents' house were hard. I got sick a lot. Headaches, stomach aches, feeling tired all the time. My grandmother took me to Dr. Roberts, who said it was all because of stress. He wanted to put me on medicine to help me sleep, but my grandmother said we should try natural remedies first. I couldn't eat properly. Everything tasted like nothing. My grandmother would make all my favorite foods, her special mac and cheese, chocolate chip pancakes, even the chicken soup that always made me feel better when I was sick. But I just pushed the food around on my plate. My grades dropped too. I used to be a good student, but now I couldn't focus in class. My mind would wander, thinking about my parents, wondering what they were doing, if they missed me at all. I kept checking my phone, hoping to see a message or a missed call from them. I would text my mom things like, "I miss you," or "Can we talk?" But she would just read the messages and never reply. My grandfather started driving me to school every morning. He would iron my clothes while my grandmother made breakfast. They tried so hard to make me feel normal, to give me a routine. My grandmother would pack my lunch with little notes inside, saying things like, "We love you," or "Have a great day." At first, those notes made me cry because they reminded me of all the things my parents never did. One day, after about a month of living with them, my grandmother was brushing my hair before bed. It was something she started doing to help me relax. She was humming some old song when suddenly she stopped. I felt something wet on my shoulder and realized she was crying. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I wish I could take away your pain. I wish I could make them understand what they're throwing away." Seeing my grandmother cry hit me hard. Here was someone who loved me so much that my pain was her pain. And there were my parents, who couldn't even look at me when I left. That's when something clicked in my head. I couldn't keep waiting for people who didn't want me. I had to start living for the people who did. Things started getting better after that. Not all at once, but slowly. I joined the school drama club because my grandmother said I needed something to keep my mind busy. I made new friends there, real friends who invited me to their houses and whose parents invited me for dinner. My grandfather taught me how to play chess. We would sit for hours in the evening, playing game after game while he told me stories about when he was young. My grandmother started teaching me how to cook. She said every person should know how to make at least 5 good meals. For the first time in my life, I felt what it was like to be part of a real family. No walking on eggshells, no waiting for the next fight to start. Just normal things like having breakfast together, watching TV in the evening, talking about our day. Other relatives started visiting more often. My mom's sister, Aunt Sarah, would come every weekend with her kids. My cousins Jake and Emma became like the siblings I never had. They would stay over, and we'd have movie nights with popcorn and sodas, things my parents never allowed. Through Aunt Sarah, I heard bits about my parents. They were traveling a lot now, going on cruises and weekend trips. They had redecorated my old room into a home office. They looked happier than ever, she said, and then quickly apologized for telling me. 6 months passed like this. I stopped checking my phone for messages from them. I stopped hoping they would show up at my grandparents' house. I focused on my new life instead. My grades went back up. I made more friends. I started feeling happy again. Then yesterday, my phone rang. When I saw my mom's name on the screen, I thought I was seeing things. I hadn't heard her voice in 6 months. My hands started shaking as I stared at the phone, watching it ring, not sure if I should answer. Finally, after what felt like forever, I picked up. For a few seconds, all I could hear was her breathing. Then she spoke, her voice different from how I remembered it, softer, almost nervous. "How are you?" she asked, like she was talking to a stranger. I sat there, not knowing what to say. How was I? How could I even begin to explain everything I had been through? The sick feeling in my stomach came back as I waited for her to say more. "I need to talk to you about something important," she said. "Are you free?" I almost laughed at her question. After 6 months of silence, after ignoring all my calls and messages, she wanted to know if I was free to talk. But something in her voice made me curious. She sounded different. Not like the cold, distant mother who had watched me pack my bags and leave. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice came out harder than I expected. She cleared her throat. "We want you to come home," she said. "Your father and I have been thinking a lot about what happened. We miss you." The words I had waited months to hear were finally being said, but they felt wrong. There was something off about how she said them, like she was reading from a script. No apology for what they did. No acknowledgement of how they hurt me. Just, "We miss you," like I had been away at summer camp. "You miss me?" I said. "You haven't talked to me in 6 months. You didn't answer when I called. You ignored all my messages. You went on vacations and redecorated my room. And now you suddenly miss me?" "We made a mistake," she said quickly. "We weren't thinking clearly. Things are different now. We want to make it right." I told her I didn't believe her. If they really wanted to make things right, they could have come to see me anytime in the last 6 months. My grandparents' house was only 20 minutes away. Instead, they chose to act like I didn't exist. She tried to say more, but I hung up. Over the next few days, she called 3 more times. My dad sent messages too, saying how sorry he was and how much he missed me. But something felt wrong about all of it. I showed the messages to my grandmother. She read them with a frown on her face and said she would make some calls. My grandmother has this network of relatives who tell her everything that happens in the family. She calls it her information highway. 2 days later, we found out the truth. My cousin Brian, who works with my dad's father, told us everything. My dad's parents had changed their will. Since my dad is their only child, he was supposed to get everything when they passed away. But they had added a new condition. My dad could only get the inheritance if I signed the papers too, and the money had to be split equally between us. If I refused to sign, everything would go to charity. My dad's parents had stayed in touch with me through cards and occasional phone calls. Like everyone else, they knew what my parents had done. This was their way of trying to fix things, of forcing my parents to make peace with me. That's when everything made sense. The sudden calls, the apologies, the wanting me back home. It wasn't about missing me or regretting what they did. It was about money. They were worried that if they didn't fix things with me, they would lose their inheritance. When my grandmother found out, she called my mom. I could hear her voice from upstairs, sharp and angry. "So this is what it takes?" she yelled. "Money? Not the fact that she's your daughter? Not the fact that you threw away your own child?" My mom tried to defend herself, saying it wasn't just about the money. She said I would benefit from the inheritance too, so I should think about my future. But my grandmother wasn't having any of it. "You are no longer my daughter," she told my mom. "I'm ashamed to have raised someone who could be so heartless." After that call, I blocked both my parents' numbers. I didn't want to hear any more of their fake apologies or excuses. The truth was out, and in a way, it made things easier. At least now I knew exactly where I stood with them. Some people might think I'm crazy for giving up a chance at inheritance. But money from people who only want me around because they're forced to? That's not worth anything. My parents showed me who they really are, twice now. First when they threw me out, and again when they only wanted me back because of money. I'm staying with my grandparents. They've shown me what real family looks like. People who love you no matter what, who put you first, who make you feel wanted and cared for. My room here isn't just a room anymore. It's my home. My grandparents aren't just taking care of me. They're raising me, loving me, helping me grow. Yesterday, my grandfather and I were playing chess, like we do most evenings. He was telling me about how he met my grandmother, and how they knew right away they wanted to spend their lives together. Then he looked at me and said, "Family isn't about blood or money. It's about love. And you, my dear, are more loved than you know. I won that chess game, by the way. First time ever. And as my grandfather pretended to be upset about losing, while my grandmother laughed and took pictures of us, I realized something important. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to have. Sometimes life takes away the people who don't deserve you and gives you the ones who do. I don't know what will happen with the inheritance, and honestly, I don't care. I have everything I need right here. 2 people who love me unconditionally, a home where I feel safe and wanted, and the chance to grow up surrounded by real love, not the fake kind that comes with conditions attached. My parents? They can keep their perfect marriage and their money. I hope it makes them happy. As for me, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the people I'm supposed to be with. And that's worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.